Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
You know, it's funny. When we talk about dictators like Hitler, Castro, those names, they're kind of burned into our collective memory.
Right, they're practically synonymous with the word dictator.
Exactly. And you'd think these two figures, coming from totally different worlds, different ideologies, different everything, wouldn't have much in common.
Different paths, same destination, sort of.
Yeah. And that's what's so wild about this deep dive. Going through all this research you sent, the parallels in how they rose to power, it's honestly kind of terrifying.
It really does make you think. Like a blueprint for how instability can give rise to authoritarianism, almost regardless of the differences in context.
Right. And that's what we're going to unpack today, these two specific cases. But it makes you wonder, like, how much of this is relevant in the world today?
Oh, absolutely. Understanding these historical echoes, that's key to recognizing similar patterns in our own time.
For sure. So let's kick things off with Germany. Weimar Republic, 1920s, 30s. Imagine this. Fresh off a World War I defeat, their economy is in shambles, like literally free fall, hyperinflation spiraling out of control. And on top of all that, their new democracy, super shaky.
Talk about a recipe for disaster. It's like the perfect breeding ground for someone to come in and exploit that chaos, that desperation for a strong leader, someone promising to restore order and national pride.
And boom, enter Hitler and the Nazi Party, right?
Right, but here's the thing. They didn't just materialize out of thin air as this unstoppable force. In the beginning, they were a fringe group, almost easy to write off.
Really? I never knew that.
Oh, yeah. But then the Great Depression hits, and suddenly their message, this whole national revival thing, blaming specific groups for Germany's problems, well, it starts to resonate with people who are desperate for any kind of solution.
Makes sense, sadly. People get desperate, they look for someone to blame, someone to offer a solution, even if it's a dangerous one.
Exactly. And while Hitler's charisma, his speaking ability, that all played a part, and the research you sent really dives into that whole manipulative side of things.
Oh yeah, he was a master manipulator for sure.
Right. But there's this other, even more chilling aspect, and the research quotes historian Ian Kershaw on this. Had they opposed it, a Hitler chancellorship would have been inconceivable. He's talking about the German elites, the people already in power.
Hold on. They enabled Hitler. Why on earth would they do that?
It seems crazy in retrospect, right? But for a lot of these conservative elites, many of whom actually hated Hitler and the Nazis.
Really? They hated him, but still.
Yeah, they saw the Nazis as a means to an end. They wanted to dismantle the Weimar Republic, which they saw as weak and ineffective, and replace it with something more authoritarian. So they thought, let's use Hitler's popularity to achieve our goals, then we'll sideline him. Talk about a miscalculation.
Wow. So they thought they could control Hitler.
Yeah.
Bold move.
Yeah, bold might be an understatement. And to understand how they even got him into a position of power, we have to look at the Weimar Republic's constitution. It had this fatal flaw, Article 48, which basically let the president bypass parliament and rule by decree if there was an emergency.
The old emergency powers loophole. History is full of those going wrong.
Exactly. And the Weimar presidents, they used Article 48 more and more, which just eroded public trust in their already fragile democracy. By the early 30s, it's practically how the country was being run, paving the way for someone like Hitler to exploit the system.
Okay, so we've got a vulnerable system, a desperate population, and a power-hungry leader waiting to pounce. What were the specific moves that got him the chancellorship?
Well, there were a few political blunders, but one name that keeps popping up in the research is Franz von Papen.
Okay, von Papen. Ring a bell, but refresh my memory.
He was a conservative politician, even served as chancellor for a bit before Hitler. He and others, they saw the Nazis as useful idiots, basically. Thought they could control them, use them to get what they wanted.
And, surprise, surprise, it backfired spectacularly.
You could say that again. But before we get into the fallout from that decision, let's hop over to Cuba for a second. While Germany was dealing with economic chaos, a different kind of crisis was brewing in the Caribbean.
Right, because Castro's rise to power is a whole other story.
Right, exactly. And while it's a different context, different circumstances, there are some eerie similarities in how these dictators exploited crises to seize control.
So we've got Germany in the 30s, total mess, and Hitler's just waiting to make his move.
Yeah.
But what's happening in Cuba at this point? How does Castro fit into all of this?
Well, Cuba's a different story. It wasn't economic devastation that fueled Castro's rise so much as it was a crisis of legitimacy, a deep-seated discontent with a brutal dictatorship.
Right, because they were under Batista's rule, right?
Exactly. Fulgencio Batista. The research you sent paints a pretty grim picture of life under his regime. He came to power in a coup in '52.
Okay, so military takeover, not exactly a great sign.
Nope. And once he was in charge, he shut down elections, established a one-party state, the whole 9 yards, ruled with an iron fist.
Wow. And I'm guessing the Cuban people weren't too thrilled about this.
You could say that again. Resentment was simmering, and it all came to a head with a young, charismatic lawyer named Fidel Castro. He became a really vocal critic of the Batista regime.
Okay, so Castro's our main player in Cuba.
Yeah.
But Batista had the military, the police, even the U.S. on his side, right?
Yeah.
What was Castro thinking, taking him on?
Well, that's what's so interesting about Castro. He understood that revolutions aren't just won with guns and ammunition, but also with ideas. He knew how to get people on his side.
So a bit of a strategist, playing the long game.
Absolutely. He understood the power of propaganda, of giving people a cause to believe in, and one of the pivotal moments in his rise was actually a defeat. In 1953, he led this daring attack on the Moncada barracks.
Hold on, I remember reading about this. That didn't go so well for him, did it?
No, it was a disaster, militarily speaking. Castro and his guys were captured and imprisoned. But here's the thing. During his trial, he gave this incredibly powerful speech.
The history will absolve me speech. I think I've heard of this.
Exactly. And that speech, even though he was on trial, it became a rallying cry. It was circulated all over Cuba, and it really galvanized the opposition to Batista.
So even in defeat, Castro managed to turn things around. That's pretty incredible.
Yeah, it was a turning point. And even though he was in prison, his message was spreading. After he got out, he went into exile in Mexico.
I bet he wasn't just sitting on a beach somewhere.
Definitely not. He was organizing, planning his next move. And that's when he connected with another key figure, Che Guevara.
Che Guevara. Didn't know he was part of the Cuban Revolution.
He was Argentinian, actually, but he believed in fighting against oppression wherever he saw it. He and Castro, they teamed up in Mexico, and in 1956, they landed back in Cuba with a small group of revolutionaries. They were ready to kick off the revolution for real this time.
So we've got Castro, we've got Che, and they're back in Cuba. I'm guessing this is where things really start to heat up.
You bet. They were strategic about it, though. They knew they couldn't take Batista head-on, so they used guerrilla warfare tactics. They set up their base in the Sierra Maestra Mountains.
Smart move. Use the terrain to your advantage. Classic guerrilla tactic.
Exactly. But what really changed the game was Castro's ability to connect with ordinary Cubans. Batista's regime was corrupt, brutal, and totally out of touch with what people needed.
I bet people were ready for a change, any change.
And Castro offered them that. He promised land reform, social justice, an end to U.S. dominance. His message was especially powerful for the rural poor and the working class in the cities.
So a message of hope, a vision for a better future, classic revolutionary stuff.
Exactly. And as his forces grew stronger, Batista started to lose his grip. People from his own army defected. There was international pressure mounting. By the end of 1958, it was clear Batista's time was up. He fled Cuba on New Year's Day in 1959. Castro and his revolutionaries had won.
Wow, what a story. But that raises the big question. What happened next? Did Castro establish a democracy like he promised?
Well, about that.
That's what I want to know. He promised all this change, right? Did he actually follow through?
He did make some social reforms. I mean, literacy rates, healthcare access, those things did improve, especially early on. The research highlights those.
Okay, so some positives there. But what about the whole democracy thing?
Yeah, that's where it gets complicated. He basically established a one-party state, cracked down on anyone who disagreed with him, and ruled Cuba for decades.
Starting to see a theme here. Start with all these promises of freedom and change, but then end up running a dictatorship.
It's a pretty common pattern, sadly. And it just goes to show how dangerous it is to have all that power concentrated in one person, one party. Doesn't matter how noble their intentions might have been at the start.
Right, because both Hitler and Castro, they justified their iron grip by saying they needed to protect the revolution, right? From enemies, internal, external, all that.
Exactly. But the end result was always the same. People's freedoms were crushed. They created totalitarian states. And the research really digs into this, how power, even when it's supposedly taken for the people, can be so corrupting.
It's a sobering thought, for sure. So two different revolutions, completely different places, but both ended up with these authoritarian regimes. What's the takeaway here? What can we learn from all of this?
Well, that's the thing about history. We can't use it to predict the future, but we can definitely spot patterns, see what conditions lead to these kinds of things happening.
Right, like those historical echoes we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. And I think one of the big lessons here, looking at both Hitler and Castro, is that moments of crisis, those turning points in history, they create these opportunities for huge change. But that change, it can go either way.
It's like if things are stable, economies are good, societies move towards progress, more freedom. But when there's chaos, uncertainty, people get scared, that's when they start looking for a savior, even if it means giving up some of that freedom.
You hit the nail on the head. And those decisions, the ones made by leaders, but also by ordinary people, they determine which way things swing. And something else that really stood out to me from the research is that power, even if it starts with good intentions, it can have disastrous consequences if it's not kept in check.
Because both Hitler and Castro, they started out with these big idealistic goals, right? Making their countries great again, bringing about social justice. But somewhere along the line, the power went to their heads.
It's like this vicious cycle. They get a taste of power and they crave more. They become paranoid, silence anyone who questions them. And before you know it, they've become the very tyrants they swore to overthrow.
It's like, is it even possible to hold on to your ideals once you have that much power? Does it always corrupt you?
Honestly, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Philosophers, historians, they've been debating that for centuries. But by looking at these historical figures, understanding how seductive power can be, how dangerous unchecked ambition is, maybe, just maybe, we can learn from their mistakes and build systems that prevent history from repeating itself.
Right. So we don't end up with another Hitler or Castro on our hands. So what should we be looking out for today? What are the red flags, the warning signs?
Well, we can't just assume history will repeat itself in exactly the same way. Every situation's different. But the research does point to some common themes in authoritarian takeovers.
Like what?
Well, keep an eye out for things like economic instability, societies becoming really divided, political systems that are gridlocked, and when democratic institutions start to weaken. Oh, and definitely a climate of fear and uncertainty.
Because it's not just about one bad guy coming along, right?
Yeah.
It's about the conditions that allow that bad guy to rise in the first place.
100%. And then they use these tactics, these playbooks that have worked before. Scapegoating, fear-mongering, promising simple solutions to complex problems. We've seen it all before.
And that's where we, as citizens, have to be really careful. We can't just sit back and think, it can't happen here. We need to stay engaged, speak out against injustice, and call out those tactics when we see them being used.
Couldn't agree more. It's about being vigilant, being informed, and being willing to have tough conversations. Because if these historical examples have taught us anything, it's that silence can be deadly. When good people don't speak up, when they become complacent, it creates this void that's all too easily filled by those who thrive on fear and division.
It's easy to get overwhelmed by the darkness of it all, But going through this research, seeing these patterns repeat themselves throughout history, it also kind of highlights the strength of the human spirit,
Absolutely. Even in the worst of times, under the most oppressive regimes, people always find ways to resist, to fight back, to hold on to hope.
And that's what we have to remember. Those acts of resistance, big or small, they matter. They remind us that we are not powerless, even in the face of tyranny.
So true.
Well, this has been quite the deep dive. Intense, eye-opening, but so important. It really makes you think about the world around us and how fragile things can be.
It really does.
Thanks for taking this journey with us today. Hopefully it'll inspire everyone listening to stay informed, stay engaged, and never ever take their freedoms for granted.
You're here.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.